the story of Moses and his covenant, that period of time where Moses was leading Israel, you find it in the book of Exodus is where it all begins. And that tells the story of Moses taking the people out of Egypt to the promised land. It goes on into Numbers, which talks about, it's called Numbers because the book starts with a whole load of counting. Everybody's counted at the beginning of Numbers, and then it goes on during their travels around the desert till they get to the promised land. Leviticus is a book all of priestly laws primarily, so it's all surrounding what the priests must do or not do in their capacity as priests, and what is holy and what isn't holy, and what they can eat and what they can't eat, and if something goes wrong or somebody needs to make a sacrifice for sin, which will never be a person, by the way, what they have to sacrifice for what kind of sin. There's a whole load of very specific laws in Leviticus. And then Deuteronomy is like Moses at the end of his life, as they're about to go in the promised land. He's brought them up to the border, and now he's about to die, and the person who takes over from him, Joshua, is going to take them into the land. And Deuteronomy is like one long sermon. It's like a love letter from Moses to the people, imploring them to walk in God's ways. So you'll find, when you looked at the Ten Commandments just now in Deuteronomy chapter 5, that was at the beginning of it. It's like Moses is speaking. He's saying, I went up before the Lord and I brought you down. This is what he said. And you'll find a lot of Deuteronomy is in the first person. It's, I led you here and I took you there. And that's Moses reflecting on their journey together, and then like a sermon saying, for goodness sake, walk with God, because then you'll be blessed and you'll enjoy the land, and that's what God is wanting for you. So it's a real heartfelt book, Deuteronomy, and it is heartfelt, and it's but I'm going to mainly focus on Exodus, and some things are repeated in Exodus and Deuteronomy. So I'm just sort of giving you a heads up on how those two books work, okay? So, Moses. Well, let's start with Abraham. You might remember last week when Abraham was starting to talk to God more and listen to what God wanted to say to him. In chapter 15 of Genesis, at a key point between God and Abraham, when Abraham was 86, God said to him, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions." So, if you remember, when God starts working in Abraham's life, God gives him a promise. And he says to him, go to the land I'm going to show you, and I will, and then there's 4 main parts to the promise. I will give you descendants, so I'll make you into a great nation. I will give you land. I will bless you. And then the most amazing part of it was, and all families on the earth will be blessed through you. So what God was starting with Abraham was step 1, if you like, in his long-term plan to restore human beings back to relationship with him and the glorious plan and purpose that God had for them originally in Eden. And one of the things we sort of highlighted last week, but I forgot to say on the tape, was God is speaking to Abraham, and he works in Abraham's life. Abraham is blessed as he grows and walks with God. But it's not just for Abraham, and it's not just for Sarah. God's working that in his life for a long-term plan that he has. And all the way through his talking to Abraham, you actually find that what God says to Abraham doesn't change all the time. It's not dotting about all over the place. It's in essence the same promise, but it gets developed year by year. And each time he encounters God, there's more detail, or it's more established, or it's developed. But it's not one day God saying this and the next day God saying something else and the next day it's not like that. It's one purpose that God has that he encourages Abraham in, and then when Abraham wobbles or doesn't see it happening, God speaks to reassure Abraham and to keep him on track, if you like. So as part of his promise to Abraham, it's a bit of a weird promise. He says, I'm going to tell you, know for certain that your offspring are going to be oppressed for 400 years, but I'm going to rescue them, which is a bit of a strange promise. But what God is revealing to Abraham is that the things he's working in Abraham's life now are going to have impact down the years. Now, the rest of Genesis looks at Abraham, the rest of Abraham's walk and being established in faith. And then he passes the promise down to his son, Isaac, who walks in it. And then Isaac passes that down to his son, Jacob. Jacob is a completely different personality, and he's kind of a bit all over the place. And yet still God makes him into a man of faith at the end of it. And it's Jacob, who is Abraham's grandson, who has 12 sons, who ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's in Jacob's lifetime that there's a severe famine, and God takes the Hebrews, or takes that family, because they start off as a family, down to Egypt to survive. And that's in a sense what happens at the end of Genesis. And then we're picking it up with Moses in Exodus chapter 2. 400 years have passed now, and whilst when they initially went down to Egypt, everybody was friendly to them because Joseph, their brother, had saved everybody's lives. 400 years on, Pharaoh, who runs Egypt, if you like, and it's probably the equivalent of he's the most powerful man on the earth at that time, sort of the equivalent of the President of the United States, only on steroids, if that makes sense, By this time, interestingly, the Hebrews, the descendants of Abraham, have multiplied. They're known well for multiplying, which is what God promised they would do. They would multiply and multiply. And so they're put to forced labour and they are enslaved. And when we're going to... Now Moses, there was a law in Egypt to try and keep the population of Jews or Hebrews down, that any male baby born need to be killed. And the midwives didn't obey that law because they thought it was stupid, and they found ways of saving the lives of the boys that were born. Moses' life was saved, and he was kind of abandoned in such a way to try and save his life. And he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and he Moses actually grew up, although he was a descendant of Abraham, he grew up as if he was a prince in Egypt. And I'm sure you might have seen the movies. But anyway, when Moses is 40, he sees a Hebrew, which is his own people, being oppressed by an Egyptian, and he gets a bit cross and he kills the Egyptian. And when that murder becomes known, he has to flee Egypt for his life. So when he's 40, he runs away from Egypt and he goes and settles down in the desert, and he has another 40 years in the desert. And while he's in the desert, God knows where to find him, which is the same for us. God knows where to find us when it's time to get our attention or to move us in a particular direction. He knows where to find us. And Moses encounters God in the desert, and it's a famous story of the burning bush. And if you just look at before that happens, in Exodus chapter 2, right at the end of Exodus chapter 2, I'm going to start in the middle of verse 23. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And the next thing that happens is God goes to find Moses. And he says to Moses, in a Sarah paraphrase, I'm calling you. I want you to go and get my people out of Egypt. I'm going to give you a message for Pharaoh, a very short message, where it was, let my people go. And Pharaoh was going to refuse, and then there would be a power battle, if you like, between God and Pharaoh, which God would win, and God would get his people out of Egypt. And Moses was the person who, in a sense, he was the perfect person, because he knew his way around the Egyptian court because he'd grown up there, and he was also a Hebrew, and he knew his way around the desert after 40 years in the desert. And that was Moses' job. There's some lovely passages with Moses. Moses really does not want the job. And almost there's a point where God has to force him, no, this is what you're called to do, and this is what you're going to do. And Moses does go. But, and actually, although he's unwilling to begin with, when you see him not far later leading the people, you see him many times pleading for the people before God, or interceding for them. I mean, he does lay down the rest of his life to lead them. And he does it with passion for them and for God. And so he does very quickly start to show that he's the right person for the job. And of course, over the time, it's ups and downs, a bit like some of our timelines. But through that process, he becomes one of the giants to Israel. Moses and Abraham are two of the giants from the Old Testament. But just notice that this is 400 years, more than 400 years after Abraham. Probably getting on for 500. So what was happening 500 years ago? That's what, the 1600s? And God is speaking to... So it would be like God speaking to somebody now, saying, I've remembered my promise to somebody who lived in the 1600s. That's how long's gone past. But God, you see, what was established between God and Abraham, which was initiated by God, but God then established because Abraham responded and cooperated, became something that could then influence what was happening 400 years down the line. So the moral to that story is, don't underestimate when you allow God to work in your life, even when it's painful or doesn't make any sense. You never know what he's doing in you could have an impact on future generations in a way that you will never know, because that's what happened for Abraham. So that's where we have Moses. Now, what happens next is Moses keeps going to Pharaoh. Pharaoh keeps saying no. And then God sends a plague on Egypt. And there's a famous, that is famous, people will talk about the plagues of Egypt. And then Pharaoh would start saying, oh yes, you can go this far, you can do that much. And then the next day he'll say, oh no, I've changed my mind. And so this would keep happening, but it becomes a crescendo where basically God, by his power, defeats Pharaoh and gets his people out of Egypt. The Passover happens before they come out of Egypt, which I'm just mentioning because it's there, but we haven't got time to talk about it. And then after the Passover, God leads them out with Moses, and they end up crossing the Red Sea. And again, I don't know how you imagine crossing the Red Sea, but it took the people of God, and there's probably, I think, was it 2 million of them? Once you've included children, elderly, all their goats and sheep and everything, crossing a sea, and it took them all night to cross. And I always imagine somewhere at the edge there must have been a wall of sea, and you had to walk across that all night. That takes a lot of courage. So they crossed the Red Sea, and then the sea closed, and that was the end of Pharaoh and all his chariots. And in Exodus 15, Miriam, who's Moses' sister, takes up a tambourine, and they have a party to celebrate that they are now free. And there are 3 main things that happen in the Mosaic covenant. Okay, first of all, God has set them free. Okay, when you read Deuteronomy 5, the first thing God says to them is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and of the house of slavery. Now it's become the way we think about the law and the Old Testament that somehow we think that the people had to keep the laws in order to be saved. But that is not what happened. God saved them first. He rescued them first. That wasn't by their effort, that was God's effort. God saved them. They had to walk in it, they had to cooperate, they had to actually cross the sea. But God was the one who rescued them. There's a wonderful verse, we might look at it in, actually if you look in Exodus, I'm jumping about a bit, sorry. Exodus 19. This is just after they've crossed the Red Sea. And the first thing God does is he brings them to Mount Sinai, which was the rendezvous point that God gave Moses when he called him. When Moses met God in the burning bush, he met him on Mount Sinai. And God says to Moses, you will bring my people back to me here. So this was a known plan that Moses knew. And when they get to Mount Sinai, which isn't very many weeks after they've come through the Red Sea, God says, verse 3, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And in a little bit, I'll just stop there because that's very beautiful. So God is saying, I've brought you to me. I've brought you on eagle's wings. It's a beautiful image of I've rescued you and I've brought you to me. And this is at the heart of the Mosaic covenant. God, first and foremost, brings his people to himself. And I think God's excited. He's going to appear to them on the mountain. Now, unfortunately, when he appears, well, not unfortunately, because it's intended, he is really quite scary. There's thunder and there's lightning and there's all sorts going on. But this is because this is Almighty God. But he's wanting to come nearer to his people. And he's brought them to himself. And before he comes down and appears on the mountain, he says to Moses in this chapter, he invites the people. He says, if you'll walk in my ways, I will make you a kingdom. You will be, what's this? My treasured possession. You'll be like no other kingdom on earth. You'll be mine. You'll be priests and you'll be holy. And then he says, ask them if they want to do this. And they say, oh yes, we'll do everything God says. They say that quite a lot, but then so do we. Oh yes, we'll do everything God says. So actually, God doesn't impose on them. He rescues them, he brings them to himself, and then he says, do you want to be my people? Will you be my people? And they say, yes, we want to be your people. And so then that's when God then appears to them on Mount Sinai and gives them the law. And it's funny, even the word law immediately makes you flinch and not want to do it. But this is the first time we've got used to the Ten Commandments. It is the basis of many nations' laws. It seems obvious to us. It's not a good idea to murder people. It's not a particularly good idea to commit adultery. Lying is not great. These things are obvious in some ways, but they weren't obvious at the time. This was completely new. And when we look at those 10 commandments, if you like, they're God's top 10 most important things at that time, because he's going to build on it. It's the first draft of the law, if you like. They tell us that, first of all, for this relationship to work, God has to be the only God. And I liked what you said earlier, Ali. It's like a marriage. If this marriage is going to work, there's only one wife and one husband. That's how it's going to be. And then when God is at the centre and is in his rightful place, because he is Lord, then our relationships with others are also impacted. And if you look at this passage, and we've explored it a little bit tonight, we've seen that God values certain things. He values truth because he doesn't lying. It is against his personality. It's against his character. He values faithfulness. He values rest. The Sabbath represents, as I've said before, one of his main commands is you must have a day off. But that day off represents lots of things. It represents trust. If you have to stop work and down tools once a week, it's a way of saying, I work 6 days a week, but I trust you, God, to provide. So having to stop for a day is a way of saying, yes, I work hard, but ultimately, God, you're my provider. There's a, I don't know how to say it, there's an understanding between God and his people in the Sabbath. And so when we start to look at it and look at it from the point of view of what it reveals about God and what it tells us about his personality, and if you look also at the end, now where was it? I'm sorry, I'm flicking back to the Deuteronomy chapter, Deuteronomy 5. That little passage at the end.
What chapter?
It's Deuteronomy 5, verse 29. Moses is saying what God said to him. And it was, "Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and to keep all my commandments, that it might go well with them and with their descendants forever." And a little bit later it says in verse 33, "You shall walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you possess." And one of the things we found when we looked at Deuteronomy and we looked at the law, I remember when we were in Africa, we decided we were going to spend a week on Deuteronomy. And when I talked to the students at the end of the week, they said, "Oh, when you said we were going to spend a week on Deuteronomy, we were like really miserable." But we did go through it. And when they got to the end, what was amazing was when we went through it, how many times it said, "For your good, for your good, for your good." That the heart of the law was so that you will prosper, so that you will live, so that you will have a quality of life that's full of life. Now, if you remember last week, I said each of the covenants build one to the next. And you can't throw out the previous one and try and do the next one. So if you throw out what Abraham learned about relationship with God, about walking with him, about learning to trust him, and you decide to eject that and just try and keep the law, that's when you end up with lifeless, rigid, some of the things, the words you used, oppressive, because to understand the law we have to know our God. And to know that he's good, and to know that he's trustworthy, and know that his word is for our good. And when we see it from that point of view, his law is not there to oppress us, but to give us a quality of life that was not known before. That's the purpose of it. And the law is not there to teach people. We don't keep the law in order to be saved. But if we go back to what God said at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, he said, "I am the Lord your God, I have brought you to myself. I've taken you out of slavery. So you're a people who are set free, you're my people, and now I'm going to show you what holy lives look like. I'm going to show you what my people look like. If you're going to walk in my ways, this is what my people, this is the lifestyle that my people look like." And that's what he's showing it. And it's important because if you flick over to Deuteronomy 4, verse 8, it says, and this is Moses speaking, "See, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today?" So what's being revealed there is, again, like Abraham, the work that God was doing in Abraham was not just for Abraham. It was going to benefit generations after him. And the work that God's doing with his people was not just for them. It was so that there was a people now, a nation on the earth that knew God and demonstrated it in their lives, so that other nations who had other gods that taught them different things would look at Israel and say, wow. And they would get a chance to see something of what God was like. They were going to demonstrate what God looked like, to some degree, imperfectly of course, to the nations. And actually, when we get to it, that does happen in Solomon's reign, at the peak, like before it all goes horribly wrong, but at the peak of Israel, the Queen of Sheba comes to see this great nation and the wisdom of Solomon. And she says, I've come because I heard that there was great wisdom in this nation, but what I have seen surpasses what I heard. And she thought it had been exaggerated, but when she came, she said, no, this is beyond what I imagined. And so nations were beginning to notice these are different people who live a way that speaks of their God. So we've got they started free. And then they learnt that now they were God's people, they were going to live a different way. And that was going to be a quality of life that was going to impact their relationship with one another, but also beyond, which is where the law fits in. But then there's another element to the Mosaic covenant, which is in also Deuteronomy. I think it's Deuteronomy, or it might be Exodus. Where is it? We're getting there. Exodus 25. Are you all right? Is it all making sense to some degree? Exodus 25. It's a very little verse. Verse 8. God says, "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst." That's it, that's the only verse. I got you looking it all up just for that. What God's saying there is, his people live in tents. They are going to be nomadic people for some time. And what God's saying is, you're going to put up a tent for me, because I'm going to live right in the midst of you. Which is amazing. I mean, that hasn't happened since Eden, has he been so close to his people. And it's a bit like him saying to us today, build a house next door, I'm going to move in. You know, he's getting closer. And it's and that's also at the heart of this covenant. There is the reason that they're needing to live their lives in a different way is that they are having a holy God move right into their midst. And when they camp, and there are all sorts of instructions about where they camp and where they put their tents up and what order they do. And when they camp, there are 3 tribes to the north, 3 tribes to the east, 3 tribes to the south, 3 tribes to the west, and right in the centre is the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is a tent. It's a very fancy tent, very specifically built, and it houses the glory and the presence of God. And it's right in the centre of them. And there's all sorts of laws, as well as a particular tribe who's in charge of looking after the poles and the tent and all the bits inside it, and they're in charge of all of those things. And they always travel, unless there's specific reason when the priest has to go at the front, they're generally right in the middle of his people. That's where God wants to be, with his people. And I think he's really excited to be with his people. And I think Moses is quite excited, but quite a lot of the others are a bit unsure, because he's a bit scary and big. and so there's this conflict, if you like, between those who know God and want to draw near, and those who are afraid of God and want to draw away. But at the heart is God wanting to be close to his people. And when you get to Deuteronomy, and Moses does his preach, he's brought them right up to the edge of the promised land over many years, leading them, and he says to them, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Keep your heart fixed on him and walk in his ways, and all will be well for you. And we tend to think of it in terms of, whenever we read about the curse, nasty old God, if you don't do what he tells you, he's going to inflict you with stuff. But actually what is happening is, the earth is already under curse because we've walked away from God and he is life. What God is actually doing is he's saying, I am opening a way for you to experience blessing again. I'm opening a way for you to experience my life again. And I'm giving you that choice, which before we didn't have that choice. And that just goes to, there's at the end of Deuteronomy, I'm nearly there, coming into land. At the end of Deuteronomy, there are 3 points to the law and to what Moses says to the people and asks them to remember. It says, if you will walk with God, you will experience blessing and life. That's a new choice they didn't have before. If you disobey, if you don't walk with me, if you walk away from me, you will experience destruction and curse. Now what God's actually saying is, you'll go back to where you were in Egypt. You'll go back to how life was. But the number 3 is the most important. But if you find you've gone away from me and you earnestly seek me and you come back, you'll be restored. I will restore you fully to the life that you had before. So in very basic, simple terms, this is what the choice is that God's giving to his people. And Moses ends that passage by saying, choose life, which Moses said before Wham! I still think of the Wham t-shirts. But yeah, choose life, but not the sort of Wham life, which was, cocktails by the pool and on the dole or whatever. This was actual life that they were being offered. This is a new way of living, and this is your opportunity. Keep your heart fixed on God. And so that, in a very great nutshell, is the Mosaic covenant. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that your heart is to be close to your people. Because you want to be near. And I thank you that when we mess up, right from the beginning, you made a way for us to be restored to you if we sought you again. And I thank you that you know our frailty, that you know we're not going to get it right. all the time. But you've made that way so that we can always come back if we turn our hearts to you. And you'll restore us to that life and blessing. And give you all the glory, Lord. Amen.